Since Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, one question has haunted the world. Where will Putin strike next? Some feared Europe, maybe Finland, maybe the Baltics. But the real answer? It's already happening. And it's happening in Africa. While the world watched Ukraine, Putin quietly opened a second front. One not built with tanks and missiles, but with mercenaries, gold mines, propaganda, and terror. Russia's next conquest isn't just about territory. It's about funding the war machine, expanding global influence, and creating a new empire right under the West's nose. And to understand just how deep this operation runs and how dangerous it really is, we need to go back years before Ukraine to when Putin's African campaign first began. It was in 2018 that the Russian state-funded private military company, the Wagner Group, first arrived in the Central African Republic, or CAR, beginning a terrible new age of terror and fear for many of the country's citizens. But they weren't there to invade or attack. They were actually invited by the country's president, Faustin Archange Touadera. Elected in 2016, Touadera initially made lofty promises to make CAR a united country, a country of peace. However, his actions since then tell a very different story. Just a year into his reign, President Touadera sought support from Russia, heading to the Russian city of Sochi for a meeting with Russia's foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov. Some experts believe that he was fearful of a possible uprising against him and was therefore eager to strengthen his security to safeguard his position of power. Just a couple of months after that meeting, Russia started to supply the CAR with various weapons, including Kalashnikov rifles and pistols, as well as much heavier firepower in the form of rocket launchers and surface-to-air missiles. Then, in May of 2018, Touadera visited Russia once more, this time for a meeting with President Vladimir Putin himself. And this, it is believed, is where Russia confirmed the terms of its payment for all of those weapons and protections. During the meeting, the two leaders agreed that Russia's military advisors and mercenaries, like those of the Wagner Group, would be dispatched to various regions of the CAR. In exchange, Russia would receive mining licenses, allowing it to extract gold, diamonds, and other precious resources from the African mines. In July 2018, Putin sent the first Russian mercenaries to Bangui, the capital city of the CAR. There they quickly got to work training Central African soldiers, protecting the president and other important government officials, and securing the activities of Russian companies which were also heading to the CAR to start work in the mines. Not long after that, reports of terrible crimes and human rights violations began to emerge. Most common amongst them were reports of the rape of CAR women perpetrated by the Russian mercenaries. Approximately 5.5 million people live in the Central African Republic. A vast majority of those people, up to 75% according to most estimates, work in agriculture, which is pivotal for the nation's economy and the health of its people. Many of those farm workers are women who head out each day to tend to the crops, gather water, and carry out a vast range of farm duties. According to reports, a pair of teenage sisters who lived near the town of Buar left for work one morning just as they had so many times before. But that day, tragically for them, would be different. The girls crossed paths with members of the Wagner Group, who cornered and captured them. The girls were fearful for their lives, as they told Philip Obaji Jr., a Nigerian journalist who had been investigating Wagner Group crimes across Africa. "We told them we were virgins and asked them not to touch us," said one of the girls, aged 17. But the Russian mercenaries didn't care. They took turns raping the girls. Whenever we tried to scream for help, they used their hands to cover our mouths so that nobody could hear us. The other girl was celebrating her 15th birthday that very day. Her sister described how she was pinned to the floor before being slapped and punched. There were wounds all over her face. She was beaten to a point where she could barely talk or even see clearly. Another story reported in the news involved a girl who was just 14 at the time, walking with her grandmother on the outskirts of Buar on the way to the family farm. They became aware that a pair of Russian mercenaries had started to follow them, but could do little to escape their fate. The Russians caught up with him. One aimed his gun at the grandmother and the other grabbed hold of the girl. "I was raped by two men. They ordered my grandmother to lie on the ground with her forehead touching the grass while they abused me." These stories are just two of many, many more reported. Local market traders in Buar told The Guardian how many other local women have reported being raped and assaulted by white soldiers in the area. "Our daughters are no longer safe in their own farmlands," summed up one market trader, Felicite Padu. A recent report from Doctors Without Borders reinforces that claim, noting that between 2018, when the Wagner Group arrived, and 2022, the organization treated around 20,000 victims of sexual violence and assault, reportedly perpetrated by the Russians and their local associates. If we talk about rape, it happens everywhere. For example, in the capital of Bangui, women suffered violence in a maternity hospital when they were raped by Russian soldiers, some of them still bleeding after giving birth. Unfortunately, in the Central African Republic, this is the way of war, explained Obaji. Now, all across the country, women and girls live in fear of rape at any time they leave their homes, especially those living in an area with heavy Russian military presence. Some have even stopped leaving their homes altogether, abandoning their jobs in fear for their lives. This has had a dramatic impact on the country's economy, with food prices skyrocketing by more than 50% in the Boer area since the start of 2024. To make matters worse, local women and girls feel completely unable to report or seek justice for the crimes committed against them. The grandmother of the 14-year-old girl, for example, explained, "The white soldiers are above the law. Nobody will punish them for what they did." The teen also refused to seek any medical assistance after her assault, worrying about stigma or repercussions for speaking up about sexual violence. She's forced to live on with her trauma alone, stating, "Whenever I walk on the streets, I fear someone will attack me." Rape is just one of the many crimes the Russians have brought to the Central African Republic. At least 3 Russian companies, namely Diamville, Lubaye Invest Sarlu, and Midas Resources, have taken control of gold and diamond mines within the country. All 3 of these companies have been sanctioned by Western nations like the US and Canada, but are freely mining valuable and precious commodities from their new African base of operations, with some of the income from the sale of those minerals helping to fuel Russia's war efforts in Ukraine. Those mines are guarded by some of the more than 1,000 Wagner members said to be in the country and manned by African workers from other regions around the country who are specifically selected and deemed loyal to Russia. The mercenaries use a range of weapons and vehicles to guard the area, and they don't shy away from firing on anyone who gets in their way or seems to be any sort of a threat to their operations. Usually when the Russians go into a gold mine, they have helicopters flying in the air. And then they have ground troops moving into this area, and they begin to open fire indiscriminately. The bullets could hit anybody, whether it's a miner or whether it's a non-miner, but they believe that everyone in the community either is armed or are working for the rebels or the government. So they show up in these communities where the mines are and then begin to open fire. Obagi also revealed that many of the Wagner victims are minors, including teenagers who often work in the mines to support their families. These ruthless and indiscriminate killings have been going on since the Wagner group arrived, but have become more widespread with time. In 2018, Russia only controlled a handful of the mines, but from 2019 onward, the Wagner group extended its grasp, taking control of more gold mines in the central and eastern part of the nation, before moving north to capture even more resources, bringing death and fear wherever they went. One 23-year-old miner named Sadak, in an interview with Al Jazeera, told how he moved to the CAR town of Koki in late 2021, hoping it would be a safe space in which to live and work. He and others like him had been forced to move from place to place in search of safety since the Russians arrived. Some of us decided to move to Koki because we thought at the time that no one was disturbing artisanal miners in the region. We soon found out that we made a huge mistake. Less than a year after arriving in the area, Sadak witnessed something terrible. On a Sunday morning, the Russian paramilitaries, arrived by helicopter near the mine in Koki, where miners mostly live, and started shooting at people. They killed 12 civilians, some of whom were artisanal miners on that day. It wasn't the first time he'd seen something like that. He had previously worked at the Indasima gold mine before Russian mercenaries came and ordered him and his team to leave, opening fire and killing 8. The victims were people I knew so closely. They were making a living out of the work they did and catering for their families. But the white soldiers ended their lives and made the people they were looking after begin to suffer. Not long after, while working at another mine in Agbado village, mercenaries arrived again, opening fire and burning down houses, killing dozens of people, with the total estimated death count in excess of 70. Reports suggest that hundreds of other miners, not just from the CAR but from other African countries like Chad, Sudan, and Niger, have all been massacred by the Wagner group. Then there are the estimated hundreds of additional civilian deaths, with the Russians firing on anyone regardless of age, gender, or background who they feel could pose any kind of threat. For Sadak and many like him, the situation has reached a point where mining is by far one of the most dangerous jobs in the country. I don't think I want to continue with artisanal mining because it has become so dangerous. In the gold mines, we no longer face dust and toxic chemicals alone, we now face guns. But why was Russia, of all countries, welcomed into African countries like the CAR so warmly? Well, while those originally from African countries who grew up in Western nations like the US or the United Kingdom and have certain views of Russia shaped over time through the Cold War and into the modern era, opinions of Russia aren't necessarily that negative among those who grew up in Africa. Indeed, due to its history of dealing with invasions and colonialism from Western countries like France and Britain, Africa often sees those kinds of countries in a more negative light. Russia, meanwhile, was not a big colonial power in Africa, And in the modern era, it uses that fact to gain sway with African leaders and populations. It positions itself as an anti-colonial, anti-imperialist force, as exemplified by this post on X from the Russian embassy in South Africa in late 2022. Russia was among the few world powers that neither had colonies in Africa or elsewhere, nor participated in the slave trade throughout its history. Russia helped in every possible way the peoples of the African continent to attain their freedom and sovereignty. In reality, Russia did indeed try to establish colonies in Africa. In the 1880s, for example, the Russian explorer Nikolai Ashanov attempted to form a colony in Ethiopia but failed. There are also strong arguments against the idea that Russia helped, in every possible way, the African people to gain freedom. However, Russia is very experienced in propaganda, and it uses all the tricks in its book to paint itself as a friend to Africa, a reliable, trustworthy, and powerful partner that African leaders and politicians in particular can rely on. It also positions itself as an opponent to France, which was one of the biggest colonial powers across Africa, as well as a country that gets things done and will stop at nothing to help its allies. As an example of this, when rumors of a rebel uprising emerged ahead of the CAR's 2020 elections, the then Russian ambassador in Bangui, Vladimir Titorenko, publicly threatened to kill the head of the rebels, former CAR President Francois Bozize, stating the former president should renounce the armed struggle, otherwise he would be neutralized by the armed forces. These kinds of statements may sound shocking to some, but they're often seen in a positive light by leaders of various countries across Africa that have faced years or even decades of turmoil, rebellion, and strife, and just want to solidify their power or move their countries forward. And it's not just with guns or violence that Russia is exerting dominance in Central Africa. The country is also using other, more surreptitious means to make its mark on the CAR and the rest of the African continent. In 2022, for example, Russia consecrated its first Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate in the Central African Republic. A Russian priest, Father Sergei Voyamawa, heads up the church and has played his part in conducting over 700 baptisms since its opening. It's also had a huge cultural and spiritual impact on the surrounding community, with local people taught all about Russian Orthodox iconography, canon, and traditions. The church also has its own school for orphans, also funded by Moscow. There, children are taught the Russian language, among other things, and since the country is gripped by such strong economic turmoil, many local kids are more or less forced to attend in order to receive any kind of education. As an added incentive, the school provides food and clothes to its students, and this church is one of many. In fact, according to a report by Ukrainska Pravda, Russia has opened more than 350 churches across the African continent in the last few years. It's also rebaptized around 260 priests to follow the Russian Orthodox faith and teach the African people about the traditions and religious canon that form such a strong part of Russian culture. Many of these churches also play deeper roles in their communities thanks to the presence of their own schools, as well as cultural and community centers in which people are taught the Russian language, elements of Russian culture, and propaganda that paints the country in the brightest light. It's clear to see that this is no mere religious mission. Russia is using its expanding network of African churches as political tools, forming a vast web of influence across the continent, which could in the future be used to recruit more men for its military campaigns and women to support its many defense-oriented industries. A Russian former Archbishop, Leonid Gorbachev, effectively explained the plan in an interview with the Journal of the Moscow Patriarchate, stating, "The African continent has a population of 1.3 billion and 54 countries with official sovereign status. On the territory of these countries, there are numerous Christian and pseudo-Christian formations and sects, many of which started asking to join us after the Patriarchal Exarchate was established in Africa. This is a lengthy process which requires more than just refresher courses. These are people who must be reforged in the Orthodox sense." The construction of churches is just one example of Russia's soft power plays on the African continent. It also has exerted strong media influence in countries like the CAR. There, a Russian company called Labaya Invest, which is affiliated with the Wagner Group, funds a radio station called Lengo Sengo. The station was formed in late 2018, just as the Wagner mercenaries arrived. Its role? To essentially whitewash the Russian forces and their war crimes. In 2023, Russia took this concept one step further. It launched the so-called African Initiative, a continental propaganda campaign publishing materials in English, French, Arabic, and Russian, and spreading falsified or exaggerated news reports about Russia's alleged humanitarian, cultural, and educational initiatives across the continent. As part of the initiative, Russia has opened media offices in places like Burkina Faso and Mali, employing both Russian and local journalists to spread its news and influence. Having reviewed the kind of media that these offices are putting out, Obagi explains, "You would be shocked by the level of Russian disinformation being spread in West and Central Africa. Russia makes Africans believe that on the one hand Ukraine is caught up in a war between the United States and Russia, and on the other hand, many Africans do not support Ukraine because they believe the US is using Ukraine to destroy Africa." In addition, several Russian houses have opened up across Africa since 2024. In these places, similar to the aforementioned schools and centers, children are taught to speak, write, and read Russian, as well as being educated about Russian culture and history, with many lessons yet again twisting the truth to portray Russia in the best possible light. All of this paints a very clear picture. Russia is targeting Africa with a mixture of both hard and soft power strategies, deploying mercenaries while also building churches, all to strengthen its stranglehold of the continent and its people, influence them to support Russia, and turn against the West. And in March 2025, far-right Russian philosopher Alexander Dugin essentially confirmed this. In a media interview, he suggested a future in which an African Union or African Empire could form to take revenge on the colonial forces of the Western world. He called on Africa to abandon the border separating its lands, to reject its colonial past, to forge an alliance with Russia, and to unify as one. To Obagi, what Russia is doing is in effect a form of colonialism. It is spreading its tendrils across the country, effectively forcing local people and communities to learn its language, culture, and traditions, sharing propaganda far and wide, and telling Africans how they should live, all while soaking up as many resources as it possibly can. And this isn't good news for Ukraine in the West. The more influence Russia exerts over Africa, the more powerful it could become. Already, the Russian companies operating there are believed to be turning over billions of dollars a year, much of which supports the state budget and finances the ongoing Ukraine war. This also makes it easier for Russia to cope with the likes of sanctions and punishments imposed upon it by Europe and other countries. After all, Africa is a veritable goldmine of resources, more than enough to fuel Russia and bolster its economy for generations to come. There are also millions of Africans slowly but surely becoming indoctrinated to the Russian way of thinking, many of whom might even take up arms for the nation in the future, whether that be in Ukraine or on the battlefields. What are your thoughts on Russia's push into Africa? Could this strategy pay off, and what part might Africa play in not just the ongoing Ukraine invasion, but the future of our world? Share your thoughts in the comments. Now go check out this video or click on this other video instead.